The morning sunlight streamed through the lush green leaves of the quiet neighborhood where Jeremiah lived with his family. The cheerful chirping of birds filled the air, blending with the distant hum of car engines. Jeremiah, a 14-year-old black boy, stood at his front door, carefully tying his shoelaces. Max, a yellow Labrador with a soft, silky coat, wagged his tail eagerly, waiting for his owner. "Hold on, Max. I'm not done tying my shoes yet." Jeremiah laughed, petting Max before standing up and grabbing the dog's leash. Max wasn't just a dog. He was Jeremiah's best friend. Ever since Max entered his life 2 years ago, the two had been inseparable. When Jeremiah faced difficulties at school because of teasing about his skin color, Max was always his source of comfort when he came home. "Let's go, Max. It's such a beautiful day today." The pair walked down the gravel path leading to the park near their house. Leaves swayed gently in the breeze, and the refreshing scent of green grass lingered in the air. Jeremiah loved mornings like this. No homework, no noise, just him and Max enjoying the world together. As Jeremiah was engrossed in chatting with Max, he didn't notice a police patrol car slowly approaching from behind. Inside the car, Officer Daniel Moore watched the boy with a look of suspicion. Officer Daniel Moore had been in law enforcement for over 15 years. To him, any unusual behavior was a potential threat. When he saw Jeremiah and Max, Moore instinctively slowed down, feeling the need to investigate. "What's that kid up to?" Moore muttered, his hand unconsciously resting on the gun at his hip. Jeremiah didn't notice the patrol car until Moore stepped out and called out, "Hey, kid, stop right there." Startled, Jeremiah turned around. He saw a middle-aged man in a police uniform, his stern face advancing toward him. "What's the matter, officer?" Jeremiah asked politely, though slightly confused. "Your dog, is it dangerous?" Moore asked, his tone filled with suspicion. Jeremiah glanced down at Max, who was calmly standing by his side, wagging his tail as usual. "No, sir. Max is very gentle. He wouldn't hurt anyone." Moore still wasn't convinced. He stepped closer, his cold eyes fixed on Max. "Tighten the leash. I don't want to see it running loose." Jeremiah complied, feeling uncomfortable but not wanting to cause trouble. However, Max, sensing Moore's aggressive demeanor, began barking loudly. "Calm down, Max." Jeremiah crouched to soothe him, but Max continued barking. Suddenly, Moore drew his gun. "Don't do that. Max is just scared," Jeremiah yelled, panicking. But it all happened too fast. Moore pulled the trigger, and the gunshot shattered the quiet morning air. Max collapsed to the ground. Jeremiah froze, unable to process what had just happened. "No, Max, get up. Max." He dropped to his knees, cradling Max in his arms as tears streamed down his face. Moore took a step back, his expression a mix of discomfort and cold detachment. "I did what was necessary to protect the public." Jeremiah looked up, his eyes burning with rage and grief. "You just killed my best friend." Passerby, hearing the gunshot, used their phone to record the scene. Within hours, the video spread across social media at lightning speed. The community was shocked by Moore's actions. "This is blatant racism," read one of the top comments among thousands of critical responses. On television, news reports about the incident were aired repeatedly. Residents from Jeremiah's neighborhood gathered at the park to show their support for him and to condemn Moore's actions. Jeremiah didn't leave the house all day. He sat quietly in his room, his gaze empty as he stared out the window. Max's collar was clenched tightly in his hand, as if it was the only thing keeping his friend's memory alive. Jeremiah, his mother, Rachel, stepped into the room and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to face this alone. We will fight for justice for Max." Jeremiah looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "But Mom, who will listen to us?" To them, Max was just a dog, nothing more. Rachel pulled her son into a hug, silently vowing that she wouldn't let this injustice be forgotten. Meanwhile, Harold Bennett, Jeremiah's father, received news of the incident from his colleagues at the police department. When he saw his son's name appear in the report, he couldn't believe his eyes. Jeremiah? Why is it my son? Harold rushed home, ignoring the curious glances from his colleagues. When he stepped into the house, he found Jeremiah sitting in the living room, his eyes cold and fixed on his father. What are you going to say, Dad? That it was an accident? That my friend didn't deserve to be killed? Jeremiah shouted, his voice trembling. Jeremiah, I didn't realize it was this serious. You're the chief of police. You know everything that happens in this city. And yet you couldn't protect your own son. Rachel stepped between them, trying to defuse the tension. Stop it. This isn't the time to fight. We need to stand together. Harold felt as if his heart were being torn apart. As police chief, he had sworn to uphold justice. But now that very justice was being called into question. He looked at Jeremiah, his son whom he loved deeply but had never fully understood. I promise you, Jeremiah, I'll uncover the truth and hold whoever is responsible accountable. Jeremiah said nothing, turning away and retreating to his room as silent tears fell. Harold realized that he wasn't just fighting to protect his family. He was also facing the darkest corners of a system he had once trusted. This would be the hardest battle of his life. That evening, the atmosphere in the Bennett household was as heavy as lead. Jeremiah locked himself in his room, unwilling to talk to anyone. Rachel stood in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner, her heart weighed down with worry. Harold sat on the sofa in the living room, his head bowed, his face filled with thought. Rachel placed a plate of food on the table in front of Harold. You need to talk to him, Harold. He needs you, even if he won't say it. Harold looked up at his wife, his eyes tired and worn. I don't know where to start. Rachel, how can I protect him when the very system I'm a part of is what hurt him? Rachel sat down beside him, taking his hand in hers. You're not just a police chief, Harold. You're a father. Jeremiah needs to know that you're on his side, that you'll do whatever it takes to get justice for Max. Harold nodded slowly, as though weighing every word she said. After a moment, he got up and knocked on Jeremiah's door. Jeremiah, I want to talk to you. There was silence inside. After a few seconds, Harold heard the sound of the lock turning. The door opened slightly, and Jeremiah appeared, his eyes puffy from crying. What do you want? He asked coldly. I just want to talk, Jeremiah, not as a police chief, but as your father. Jeremiah crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe, saying nothing. Harold took a deep breath. I'm sorry I didn't protect you and Max. I failed in my role, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I want you to know that I'll do everything I can to make this right. Jeremiah stared directly at his father, his eyes filled with anger and pain. What can you do? Moore will get away with it, just like every other cop. No one cares about me or Max. We're nobodies to them. No, Jeremiah, I won't let this go. I've spent too long looking at things from the other side. This time, I'll stand with you. Jeremiah was silent for a long time before he quietly said, I don't trust you, but I'll give you a chance to prove it. The next morning, Jeremiah received a call from Marcus, the leader of a social activism organization in the city. Marcus had seen the video of the incident and wanted to meet with Jeremiah to discuss organizing a peaceful protest. We can't let this be forgotten, Jeremiah, Marcus said over the phone. Your story and Max's can wake people up. Jeremiah agreed to meet Marcus at the park where Max was shot. When he arrived, a group of people had already gathered, holding signs with slogans like, Justice for Max and End Racism Now. Marcus, a tall man with a powerful voice and determined eyes, approached Jeremiah and greeted him. You're brave, kid. Are you ready to share your story with everyone here? Jeremiah hesitated for a moment but then nodded. He stepped forward to face the crowd, holding Max's collar tightly in his hand. Max wasn't just a dog. He was my best friend. Jeremiah began, his voice trembling. He didn't do anything wrong, but he was killed by someone who couldn't see his innocence because they saw my skin color first. Jeremiah's words moved the crowd deeply. Many people were brought to tears, while others raised their signs higher in solidarity. As the protest concluded, Jeremiah felt a small sense of relief. For the first time since losing Max, he felt he wasn't alone. Meanwhile, at the police department, Officer Daniel Moore was facing increasing pressure. Images and videos of the incident had garnered widespread media attention, and many were demanding a formal investigation. As police chief, Harold could not avoid addressing the issue. He ordered Moore to be suspended from duty and called for an independent team to investigate the incident. "You know this won't be easy, Harold," a colleague warned him. "Moore has a lot of friends in the force. They'll try to protect him." Harold nodded. "I understand, but justice cannot be compromised." When Moore learned of his suspension, he was furious. "I was just doing my job. That kid and his dog were a threat." But Moore's excuses convinced no one. His actions had outraged the community, and the pressure for accountability continued to mount. Jeremiah began attending meetings at the organization led by Marcus. There, he met others who had experienced similar injustices, being treated unfairly simply because of the color of their skin. During one meeting, Jeremiah stood up to share his feelings. "I never thought I'd lose Max in such a way, and I never thought I could do anything to make a difference." Marcus smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Change doesn't come from those who stand by and watch. It comes from those willing to take a stand. Even if it's just a small step, you've already started your journey." Jeremiah felt inspired. He decided to take a more active role in the organization's efforts, from writing posts on social media to participating in community outreach events. But deep down, Jeremiah knew his battle was far from over. Moore had yet to be charged, and the system remained riddled with injustices. Still, for the first time, he felt hopeful that he could make a difference. After a long day at the police department, Harold Bennett sat alone in his home office, the light from his desk lamp illuminating the scattered papers before him. But he couldn't focus. His mind was filled with the image of Jeremiah, his son's angry, pained eyes, and the memory of the gunshot that had irrevocably changed their family. Harold's gaze drifted to an old photograph hanging on the wall. It showed him as a young officer, smiling brightly alongside his colleagues. That youthful optimism had long been replaced by the lines of worry etched on his face. He thought back to his early days in the police force, full of enthusiasm and determination. Harold had believed he could make a difference, but that passion was quickly tempered by the harsh realities of the job. He remembered one incident vividly. A fellow officer had used unnecessary force on a black man who refused to leave a public space. Harold wanted to intervene, but a senior officer patted him on the shoulder and said, "You're young, Harold. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment. Learn to stay quiet if you want to go far." Those words, uncomfortable as they were, had stuck with Harold. He chose to turn a blind eye to minor injustices, hoping that one day, in a higher position, he'd have the power to make real changes. But as the years passed, he realized he had become part of the very system he once wanted to reform. Now, looking back, Harold couldn't help but ask himself, where did I go wrong? When did I lose my ideals? The thought stirred something deep within him. Harold stood up, resolved. He knew he couldn't repeat the mistakes of his past. This time, he would fight not just for his son, but for all those who had endured injustice. In the days that followed, Jeremiah became busier than ever. He attended community meetings where people shared their stories of injustice and discrimination. Marcus, the leader of the organization, saw great potential in Jeremiah. "You have a powerful voice, Jeremiah. You don't just represent yourself, you represent so many others. Use it to create change." Jeremiah decided to write a speech for the upcoming march. That night, he sat in his room, Max's collar placed on the desk as a source of inspiration. He began to write, "Max wasn't just a dog. He was my most loyal friend. Max helped me through my hardest days. And now he's gone because of one person's fear and prejudice. But Max's death wasn't in vain. It woke me up. And I hope Max's story will wake up others too. When the day of the march arrived, Jeremiah stood on stage, facing hundreds of people. His heart pounded. But as he looked out at the crowd, he realized he wasn't afraid anymore. Jeremiah took a deep breath and began his speech. Each word he spoke resonated deeply with the audience. The crowd erupted in applause and chanted, "Justice for Max! Justice for Jeremiah!" That march wasn't just an event. It was the beginning of a larger movement. And Jeremiah, despite his youth, had become a symbol of hope and change. Meanwhile, at the police department, the investigation into Daniel Moore began to uncover alarming truths. A former colleague of Moore, Officer Lisa Carter, decided to come forward with information she had kept hidden for years. "I can't stay silent any longer," Lisa said during a press conference. "This isn't the first time Moore has abused his power. I've witnessed him mistreat people of color without any justifiable reason. But the system protected him." Lisa's testimony, combined with newly uncovered evidence, left Moore with nowhere to hide. The media exploded with reports and investigative features. The mounting pressure on the police department forced them to take decisive action. Harold, as police chief, held a public press conference. He stood before the cameras, his face resolute. "As a father and as police chief, I promise this case will be handled with transparency and fairness. No one is above the law, not even us." Harold's words were not just a commitment. They marked the beginning of reform for a system that had been shrouded in darkness for far too long. Despite progress in the investigation, the Bennett family continued to grapple with deep fractures. Jeremiah, though he had partially forgiven his father, still felt a significant distance between them. One evening, during a family dinner, Rachel tried to ease the tension. "Harold, would you like to share with Jeremiah what you've been doing to investigate the case?" Harold set his fork down and sighed. "Jeremiah, I've done everything I can. I've suspended Moore and committed to bringing him to justice. But you need to understand that change doesn't happen overnight." Jeremiah, his eyes cold and sharp, replied, "I don't need explanations, Dad. I need action. You talk a lot, but I haven't seen anything truly change." His words cut Harold like a knife. Rachel looked at both of them, trying to stop the argument. "Enough. Both of you. We're a family. But you're acting like enemies. Max is gone. And now it feels like we're losing the bond that holds this family together too." Silence filled the room. Harold left the table and retreated to his office. Jeremiah stood up as well, slamming the door to his room. Rachel remained at the table, overwhelmed by a sense of helplessness. She told herself that if the family couldn't find a way to heal, all their efforts outside would mean nothing. Officer Daniel Moore, during his suspension, no longer exuded the confidence he once had. The pressure from ongoing investigations, public condemnation, and testimonies against him left Moore increasingly despondent. Desperate, Moore hired Richard Hayes, a high-profile attorney renowned for defending police officers in controversial cases. Hayes, with his polished demeanor and sharp legal skills, immediately began crafting a robust defense strategy. "We'll focus on proving that your actions were in the interest of public safety," Hayes said during their first meeting. "We need to create the narrative that the dog posed a genuine threat and that you were simply doing your job." Moore nodded, clinging to any hope of defending himself. But when Hayes began leveraging the media to smear the Bennett family, the situation escalated. False articles and posts circulated on social media. "Jeremiah Bennett has a history of troublemaking at school. The boy's dog had previously attacked someone." These blatant lies sparked a new wave of outrage, not just against Moore, but also against the system that enabled such tactics. When Jeremiah read the posts, he was overcome with anger and helplessness. He couldn't fathom how people could fabricate such blatant falsehoods to defend someone in the wrong. "I can't let them do this," "Mom!" Jeremiah cried to Rachel, tears streaming down his face. "I'm not a troublemaker. And Max never hurt anyone." Rachel pulled her son into a comforting embrace and whispered, "We will prove the truth. Jeremiah, they can lie, but justice will be on our side." Harold, under mounting pressure, realized he could no longer ignore the flaws in the system he had served for so long. When the smear campaign against Jeremiah emerged, he knew he had to take decisive action, not just to protect his son, but to restore his family's honor. At a meeting with senior officers, Harold stood and spoke bluntly. "I've spent my entire career protecting this city, but now I see that we're not just fighting crime on the streets, we're also battling issues within our own ranks. If we don't fix this system, we'll lose the trust of the people we've sworn to serve." Some colleagues exchanged uneasy glances, but Harold refused to back down. He announced that he would resign as police chief if Moore was not brought to a fair trial. "You're risking your entire career, Harold," one officer whispered after the meeting. "I don't care anymore," Harold replied. "My career means nothing if I can't protect my own family." That evening, Harold returned home and sat down with Jeremiah. "I've decided to step down as police chief," Harold said. "I want to do what's right, not for my reputation, but for you." Jeremiah looked at his father, seeing for the first time a resolve in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Dad." The trial of Daniel Moore unfolded under intense media and public scrutiny. Jeremiah, Rachel, and Harold sat in the front row, while Moore sat on the opposite side with his attorney. Attorney Hayes began his defense strategy by arguing that Moore acted appropriately in a situation he perceived as a safety threat. He emphasized that Max was a large dog and could have been dangerous. However, the Bennett family's legal team was well prepared. They presented video evidence showing Max's calm demeanor and testimonies from eyewitnesses proving that Moore was never in danger. Jeremiah was called to the stand as a witness. Standing tall, he looked directly at Moore and recounted his story. "Max did nothing wrong. He barked because he was scared, but he didn't care. He shot Max and I had to watch my best friend die right in front of me." The courtroom fell silent, save for the soft sounds of sobs from a few in the crowd. Jeremiah struggled to keep his composure, but tears streamed down his face. The Bennett family's attorney concluded with a powerful question. "Police are meant to protect and serve. So why did Officer Moore's actions cause suffering instead of safety?" As the trial neared its conclusion, the jury delivered its verdict. Moore was found guilty of unnecessary use of force that resulted in Max's death. Jeremiah held his mother's hand tightly as the verdict was read, tears streaming down his face this time, tears of relief. After the trial, Jeremiah and Max's story became a symbol of the fight for justice. A wave of reforms was proposed within the police department, including training programs on bias and handling critical situations. Harold, though he had resigned, was invited to serve as an advisor on these reform projects. He declined a formal role, choosing instead to work directly with the community to rebuild trust between citizens and law enforcement. For Jeremiah, the trial lifted a significant burden. He decided to write a book about his and Max's story, titled The Light of Justice. At a book signing event, Jeremiah spoke to the crowd. "My story isn't just about Max or me. It's about all of us, about never staying silent in the face of injustice. Max is gone, but the light he brought will continue to shine." Jeremiah was no longer a boy consumed by grief and helplessness. He had become a symbol of hope, reminding everyone that no matter how small, each person has the power to make a difference. As time passed, the Bennett family slowly began to heal from their wounds. Harold, after resigning, spent more time with his family. However, the relationship between him and Jeremiah remained strained. Both often avoided deep conversations, neither knowing how to begin. One afternoon, Harold saw Jeremiah sitting on the old swing in the yard, clutching Max's collar tightly in his hand, watching his son, Harold felt a heavy weight on his chest. He decided to step outside, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. "I thought you might be thirsty," Harold said, placing a glass next to Jeremiah. Jeremiah glanced at his father, then nodded and picked up the glass. The two sat in silence for a long while, the only sound being the wind rustling through the trees. Finally, Harold spoke. "I know this hasn't been easy for you. I failed. I failed to protect you and Max, and I failed to understand what you were going through." Jeremiah remained silent, his gaze fixed on the collar. "You don't understand. You always sided with the police until this happened to me. Why did it take that for you to see?" Harold sighed deeply. "You're right. I was wrong for not seeing the issues sooner. But Max opened my eyes. He sacrificed himself for me to realize that justice can't just be a slogan." Jeremiah turned to look at his father, and for the first time, his eyes weren't so cold. "I just want you to know that I lost my best friend, but I don't want hatred to consume my life. I want to create change." Harold placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'll stand with you. From now on, we'll do the right thing together." That conversation marked a turning point in Harold and Jeremiah's relationship. Slowly, they began rebuilding the trust that had been lost, and Harold learned to listen to his son more closely. Jeremiah's story quickly spread across the nation. Civil rights organizations and social advocacy groups began inviting him to speak at major events. Each time he stood before a crowd, Jeremiah felt the immense weight of responsibility on his shoulders. But he never faltered. At a national conference on judicial reform, Jeremiah stepped onto the stage in front of thousands, including activists, politicians, and police officers. He began by sharing the story of himself and Max, his voice filled with emotion. "Max was my best friend. He didn't know what racism was, didn't understand prejudice. Max only knew unconditional love. I think we, as humans, have a lot to learn from a dog." The room fell silent, everyone hanging on his every word. "But I've also learned that love and empathy cannot be one-sided. We need to change how we see, how we act, not just to protect ourselves but to protect those who are more vulnerable, those who have no voice." When Jeremiah finished his speech, the entire room rose in applause. He was no longer just a victim of injustice. He had become a symbol of hope and change. The efforts of Jeremiah, his family, and the community began to yield results. A series of reforms were enacted within the city's police system. Officers were required to attend training on racial bias and nonviolent conflict resolution. Harold, though no longer the police chief, was invited to serve as an advisor on these reform projects. He worked closely with community organizations to rebuild trust between the police and the people. One day, Harold brought Jeremiah to a meeting between police officers and local residents. At the gathering, Harold introduced his son to the officers who had once worked under him. "This is my son, Jeremiah," Harold said with pride in his voice. "He's taught me more than anyone else throughout my career." Jeremiah shared the story of himself and Max with the officers, encouraging them to reflect on their roles within the community. A young officer stepped forward and said to Jeremiah, "Your story has made me think a lot. I'm going to try to do better, not just as a police officer, but as a person." Small but meaningful changes began to ripple through the community. In Jeremiah's neighborhood, people felt safer with officers patrolling the streets. The police, in turn, took the time to better understand the people they served. On a beautiful morning, Jeremiah took the family's new puppy, a white Labrador named Hope, for a walk in the park. Sunlight streamed through the trees, creating a peaceful scene. Jeremiah sat down on a bench, gently stroking Hope as he gazed into the distance. Memories of Max lingered, but now his heart was filled with hope. From afar, Harold and Rachel watched their son with smiles on their faces. Rachel took her husband's hand and said softly, "We've been through so much, but in the end, we still have each other." Harold nodded, his eyes full of pride as he looked at Jeremiah. "Our son is stronger than I ever imagined. He's accomplished things I never thought I could." Jeremiah turned and saw his parents. Waving them over, the family sat together on the bench, talking and laughing. Hope wagged her tail, running around the park as if carrying Max's message, a message of love, forgiveness, and hope. The Bennett family's story wasn't just about loss, but about finding light in the darkness and showing how every person, no matter how small, has the power to make a difference.